Alright, let's move on to Standard 9. We're still in Unit 4. Let's talk about Standard 9 here and look at it. And here's Standard 9 here, the overall focus at the top here, the Civil War. Look at it closer in a minute. We have 6 substandards, A, B, C, D, E, F. So a lot of information in this Standard 9. And let's look at this big part up here. It says the student will identify key events, issues, and individuals relating to the causes, the course, and the consequences of the Civil War. Now, we talked about a lot of these causes here in Standard 8, and we were going through those causes. We said there were many here, and we said it's very important to do well on the unit test we're going to have in class and on the EOCT to know each one of these thoroughly, okay, and how they lead to the Civil War, the causes of the Civil War. We went over Nat Turner in Standard 8. We went over the abolitionist, Frederick Douglass, Wilmore Garrison, the Grimke sisters in Standard 8, the Missouri Compromise, the Nullification Crisis, the Wilmot Proviso, and the Compromise of 1850. These are critically important to understanding these north-south divisions, north-south tensions, this hostility on a regional level, and this idea of sectionalism, where one section of the country puts its interest above this other section of the nation as a whole. This sectionalism idea. So, and these are the causes leading to the Civil War. And I think we reached all the way around to the Kansas Nebraska Act. So if we look back at 9A, it says explain the Kansas Nebraska Act. And then it says, and the failure of popular sovereignty, the Dred Scott case, and John Brown's raid. So we're going to talk about Kansas Nebraska Act. We're going to talk about the failure of popular sovereignty connected to that, Dred Scott case, and John Brown's raid, all in this video. It's going to be a little bit longer. So essentially what we're going to do is talk about Kansas Nebraska Act, the Dred Scott case here, and then John Brown's raid. All of these are causes or events that lead us to a Civil War. Okay? Alright, so now we're on the Kansas Nebraska Act here. How did it cause, the central question would be, how did the Kansas Nebraska Act cause sectionalism? How did it cause north-south divisions? How did it cause our country to lead to a Civil War? Okay? So let's look at the Kansas Nebraska Act here a minute. This word act implies that when a bill becomes a law, it's called an act. When the president signs a bill that was put together by Congress, the Senate and House of Representatives, and they send it to the president signed, it becomes an act. So this Kansas Nebraska Act, or the bill itself, was put into Congress to become a law by this man here. His name is Stephen Douglas. And Stephen Douglas is going to, let's put his name here, Stephen Douglas. Don't confuse him with Frederick Douglass, African-American abolitionist. Alright, so Stephen Douglas reopens this issue of slavery in the Louisiana Territory. If you recall, in the Missouri, in the Missouri Compromise, we talked about the Louisiana Territory, and Missouri come in as a slave state, and Maine come in as a free state. But to settle this issue of slavery within the Louisiana Territory, we said, just here in Louisiana Territory, how would it become? Well, it would answer the question, how do we know if it becomes a slave state or a free state? Well, this 3630 line was established that said everything above that line had to be free territories. If those states come in, they had to be free. In the Kansas Nebraska Act, Stephen Douglas reopens this issue of slavery in that area in the Louisiana Territory. Trade and commerce in Asia led to this movement for us to build railroads out west to the Pacific Ocean. And Stephen Douglas here wanted one to go from his area, his home state in Illinois, and he wanted a connection from Illinois all the way out and connect. Basically, it's going to become the Transcontinental Railroad. Okay, so Stephen Douglas is pushing this issue The problem is there's a railroad proposed to go through Texas, and the Gadsden Purchase in 1853. The Gadsden Purchase was bought so that a southern railroad would go from Texas out to San Francisco, California. But Stephen Douglas here was in competition with the southern portion. He wanted to build one for up in the northern area so that Illinois and the Great Lakes connection there, Erie Canal, New York City, would be a stronger connection. He pushes and proposes a bill to organize two territories, one called Kansas and one called Nebraska. Now these two territories he proposes out here in this area. In the western part of the Louisiana Territory all the way up to Canada, he proposes to organize two territories, one called the Kansas Territory and one called the Nebraska Territory. And in these two territories, here's a Nebraska Territory and here's Kansas Territory. See if I can give you a bigger picture of that. Here you go. So here's the western boundary of the Louisiana Purchase. So here's a Kansas Territory he organized, and the Nebraska Territory that was organized under the Kansas Nebraska Act. So he wants to build from Chicago, Illinois, here on the Great Lakes, a railroad line through here all the way out to San Francisco to connect the Pacific Ocean so they could trade with Asia. That's what he's wanting to do. But there was a different one that the South wanted to go through Texas, through the Gadsden Purchase this way. So what he's going to have to do is he's going to have to compete and get these Southerners to get on board with this connection of the railroad here. So what he does, and this is why things get started up, these territories were both above the the Missouri Compromise 3630 line. So originally with the Missouri Compromise they had to be free states or free territories. But in order to win Southern support and to divert tension away from that Gadsden Purchase Texas Connection Railroad, he adopted an amendment to the Kansas Nebraska Act that would amend the act and say that it would repeal the Missouri Compromise. In other words, it would get rid of this 3630 line idea that everything above it had to be slave states. So this is going to open up this big issue, this north-south tensions between abolitionists, anti-slavery Northerners, and slave-owning pro-slavery Southerners. So he's going to send this amendment in to repeal the Missouri Compromise. Alright, so it opens up this big question. Will slavery spread west in this Louisiana Territory again? And does slavery also spread into new acquired territories, was what we talked about before. And this idea is going to cause north-south tensions, north-south divisions, sectionalism, and it's going to eventually rip us apart and cause a civil war. Alright, so how did he propose to deal with this Nebraska Territory and Kansas Territory? He said, he proposed in the bill, he said that the people who would go out to Kansas, Nebraska, the people who would move out to Kansas Territory and Nebraska Territory out here, that the people themselves in those territories, that they be allowed to decide for themselves whether their states would be free or slave. We call this popular sovereignty, this term or idea where the people decide for themselves whether they're going to be slave or free is called popular sovereignty. Now he gets this idea from what happened in the Compromise of 1850. If you recall, Utah Territory, New Mexico Territory in 1850 were allowed to determine for themselves whether they would be slave or free. And that was part of Henry Clay's Compromise of 1850. Territory open to slavery under the principle of popular sovereignty, that the people would vote on the Constitution, and then that Constitution would say whether it's slave or free. Alright, so he proposes popular sovereignty. Alright, this Missouri Compromise line 3630 is out of the way now because the bill becomes law. The Kansas Nebraska Act is enacted. It becomes law, so this is no longer in effect, this 3630. Now we have popular sovereignty. The people themselves get the right to vote. Let's look at that vocabulary a little bit closer. Popular sovereignty, what's the definition? The people of a territory get to choose by vote They go to the polls and vote and place in their constitution, in the Constitutional Convention, if their state will be a free state or if it will be a slave state. Now, some characteristics of popular sovereignty is that the decision is made by the people. Okay? Decision made by voting, democratic means. People are the source of the law. States' rights. States decides in their constitution what they will be. Some examples of this is the Kansas Territory eventually, and then Nebraska Territory and Utah and Mexico territories we talked about already. Those are examples. Some non-examples is this Missouri Compromise of 1820 and 3630 line of latitude, and we talked about that already. That's a non-example, this 3630 line. Missouri was established and Maine was established using this line here. We're not going to use this line anymore. We're going to be using the will of the people, their vote, their decision-making power. And non-examples are these Missouri Compromise line of 1820. The United States Congress ultimately determined whether they would be slave or free using this 3630 line. Now it's people. People are going to determine through popular sovereignty. Popular is population of the people, and sovereignty, the rule of the people. They're going to determine whether they're going to be slave or free. Okay, so this opens up this question and these tensions that are going on between North and South, sectionalism, if you will. Alright, so here's an essential question we might have. Okay, what was the impact of the passage of the Kansas Nebraska Act? Because if you look, there's a second thing we have to talk about here. Explain the Kansas Nebraska Act, the failure of popular sovereignty. So popular sovereignty, this idea is going to fail just like the 3630 line is going to fail. Popular sovereignty is also going to be a failure, and it's going to lead us to war, the Civil War. It's going to be one of these north-south divisions, north-south tensions. This is an example of sectionalism. Alright, so our central question is, what was the impact of the Kansas Nebraska Act? We call this answer to this bleeding Kansas. Kansas is going to be bleeding. In other words, there's going to be so much conflict out there. And what we mean by bleeding Kansas is that there was an outbreak of a series of violent attacks between pro-slavery and anti-slavery forces in the Kansas Territory. If you recall, we talked about before the Northwest Ordinance of 1787. And Kansas, for it to become a state, for it to have a constitution, there has to be a population there. There has to be 5,000 free males to vote to set up a temporary territorial assembly, and then 60,000 to draft the Constitution in a state convention, and then apply for statehood with the Congress of the United States, U.S. Congress. And if you recall, we got this from the Articles of Confederation. We talked about it before. Here it is again. Alright, so how is this Northwest Ordinance going to impact this Kansas Nebraska Act? So what happens is a lot of people start flocking to Kansas. Out here in the Kansas Territory, people from the north up here that are anti-slavery, opposed to it, head out to Kansas. People in the south who want to protect slavery and push it further into the west go out here to Kansas Territory as well. And what eventually happens is what's called bleeding Kansas. So in Kansas area here in Kansas, a place called Lecompton is set up. It's going to be the capital of the pro-slavery group that goes into this area here in the Kansas Territory. Here on the Kansas River, they're going to set up a capital that's a pro-slavery, in other words, for slavery, right here in Lecompton. Now, Topeka, Kansas is going to be established on the same river, the Kansas River, and this capital is going to be an anti-slavery capital. So these people in the north and the Northwest Territory come out to Kansas and establish Topeka as an anti-slavery capital. Now, both of these areas form governments, Lecompton government and the Topeka government. Both of them get 60,000 people out there in that area. Both of them draw up a constitution in a state convention, and both of them send those applications to Congress. Wow. So two governments there fighting over slavery issue out west. Now, this is going to break out into some violence. Anti-slavery and pro-slavery people are going to become very violent with one another, and these series of violent attacks are going to happen out in Kansas. As examples, on May 21st, 1856, here at a place called Lawrence, Kansas, south of Lecompton, these border ruffians from Missouri, pro-slavery Missouri, who want slavery to be out in the Kansas Territory, destroy anti-slavery printing presses and burn down buildings in Lawrence, Kansas. They used 5 cannons to demolish the Free State Hotel. So they line them up, set them off, boom, cannons, balls just rip through the hotel, and this event becomes known as the Sack of Lawrence. Another event, anti-slavery violence, so on May 24th, 1856, 3 days later, probably in reacting to the Sack of Lawrence, John Brown and his 4 sons commit what's called John Brown's Massacre. It's also called Pottawatomie Creek Massacre. But they go out on this creek called the Pottawatomie Creek down here, below Lecompton area, but below Lawrence. And he and his sons violently murder 5 slave owners with broadaxes in front of their families while they cried. So this location was on a creek called Pottawatomie. So this is some violence that's going on. In all, eventually Congress, after this long battle, the Congress is going to accept the Topeka, Kansas Constitution, anti-slavery, and so slavery is going to be outlawed in the Kansas Territory. But before it does, over 200 people are going to die in what's called Bleeding Kansas. This violence takes place between pro-slavery and anti-slavery attempts to influence elections there, and ultimately whether slavery would spread west. Now, violence in Bleeding Kansas didn't just happen out in the territories. Back in Washington, D.C., there was also some violence in the United States Senate chamber between these 2 men here. This man here, Charles Sumner, is from Massachusetts. He was a senator. And this congressman here, his name was Preston Brooks. So some violence takes place between them. On May 22nd, 1856, Charles Sumner, this guy here, he rose in the Senate and gave a 2-day speech, and he blamed Southern politicians for the violence that was going on in Kansas. He specifically pointed out a guy by the name of Andrew Pickens Butler, and he was from South Carolina. Now, Butler was offended and complained to his cousin, this man here, Preston Brooks. And then Brooks, in retaliation, is also a congressman from South Carolina, approached Charles Sumner, this man here, with a cane, with a walking cane. They call it a gutta percha cane. And as Charles Sumner was sitting at his desk here in the Senate, Preston Brooks walked up and started beating him in the head with it, and beat him so bad he pulled his desk up out of the floor and bolts come loose. Now, Preston Brooks is going to be censured and he's going to be removed from Congress, but he's going to win his re-election. He's going to come back. When he comes back, Southern politicians throughout the South, they get a bunch of these canes and send it to him as a gift. So we see here that this Bleeding Kansas is going to reveal the violence there. Even in the Senate, it's going to reveal the weaknesses of this popular sovereignty and show that popular sovereignty is going to fail at settling this dispute, these divisions, this sectionalism, this ideas of region over the nation as a whole, and is eventually going to rip our country in two. This Western expansion of slavery argument, this sectionalism is revealed by outbreak of violence in Kansas. Alright, so that is the Kansas Nebraska Act. Now we'll talk about Dred Scott case. Alright, so we're finished with the Kansas Nebraska Act as a cause or event leading to the Civil War. Now we're with the Dred Scott decision. Alright, Dred Scott was a slave born in 1800 in Virginia. and he went through a series of he went through ownership before, and then to 1831 he sold to a guy by the name of John Emerson. John Emerson was a doctor. He was a surgeon for the U.S. Army, and he traveled all over the United States. And he lived in St. Louis, Missouri with his wife. John Emerson did, and he bought Dred Scott as a slave and carried Dred Scott with him as a body servant and as a valet. In other words, Dred Scott was carrying his things for him as he went from one fort to the other for the U.S. Army. And then in 1833, he travels with Dr. Emerson to Fort Armstrong in Rock, Illinois, and he stays there for about 10 years. And Illinois was a free territory. He even marries a wife there in Illinois, and they have children in Illinois. So about 10 years, for a complete decade, he lived in free country, free territory. In 1840, John Emerson's going to die. This is Dred Scott's owner. And his wife, Irene Emerson, lived in St. Louis, Missouri, which was a slave state. She demanded the return of Dred Scott to her, but there was no will where John Emerson had left in a will Dred Scott to his wife, Irene Emerson. And on November 1846, Dred Scott, with the help of a few abolitionists, files a lawsuit, here's a copy of it here, in the circuit court in St. Louis, Missouri, for his freedom. And he argues that he lived in free territory for 10 years, and that was a common occurrence, that slaves would sue for their freedom, saying that they had lived in territory for a certain period of time. So the Supreme Court, it works its way all the way to the Supreme Court, and by that time Miss Irene Emerson had died, and her brother, John Sanford, had claimed ownership of Dred Scott. And so this court case is going to become Sanford versus Scott. And in a Supreme Court decision, the United States Supreme Court, three things were decided. First, Dred Scott had no citizenship. He was not a citizen of the United States, so he could not sue in the court system at all. So his going to the courthouse and suing for his freedom was really not his right, so he couldn't do that. Number two, that slaves living in free territory. Okay. Slaves living in free territory, if a slave lives in a free territory, that does not make them free. And number three, the Missouri Compromise of 1820 was unconstitutional because it violated the Fifth Amendment right to property, that people's property cannot be taken without due process of law, and that Dred Scott was property, he was a slave, and that Missouri Compromise kept his owners from taking him into free territory. So that's the decision. We can look a little closer at Roger B. Taney, the Chief Justice of the Supreme Court, when this Scott versus Sanford decision was handed down, the Dred Scott decision. And he's from Maryland. He's a pro-slavery advocate, and he's a Chief Justice of the Supreme Court. Here's some of his quotes. One becomes a citizen by birth or by naturalization. No state accorded citizenship to blacks, ever. That's what he says. And then he says, at the time of the Constitution, blacks had for more than a century been regarded as so inferior that they had no rights which the white man was bound to respect. And it's basically said Dred Scott had no rights at all. Dred Scott was not a citizen. And then lastly, he said the Missouri Compromise had deprived citizens of their property and slaves, and implying that a Fifth Amendment violation had occurred. Due process of law. Can't take a person's property without due process of law. That line, deprive people of property without due process of law. So the Missouri Compromise was unconstitutional. That's what Roger B. Taney in the court declared. Now, this whole issue about Dred Scott decision is going to anger a lot of abolitionists. So we're going to see these northern abolitionists angered, and a lot of fury is going to occur in the newspaper and the media. And this argument over the morality of slave ownership. And then sectionalism is going to continue, north-south divisions, north-south tensions over this slavery issue. Okay. Now let's turn our attention to John Brown's raid. So we finished with Dred Scott decision. Now we're going to focus on John Brown's raid of Harper's Ferry, Virginia as an event leading to a civil war, or as a cause that's going to cause a civil war. Here's John Brown here, the same John Brown that he and his 4 sons killed 5 slave owners on Pottawatomie Creek. This is John Brown. He incites a slave rebellion in Harper's Ferry, Virginia. Here's a picture of Harper's Ferry, Virginia on the Shenandoah River. Notice the bridge here going over into the city. Here's a contemporary picture of Harper Ferry, Virginia today. It's actually Harper's Ferry, West Virginia today. West Virginia did not exist when John Brown raided the arsenal there in Virginia. It was part of Virginia. When the South secedes from the Union, Virginia is going to secede as a slave state, but West Virginia is going to stay behind. It's not going to secede. It doesn't agree with secession. We're going to talk about what secession means in a minute. So Virginia is going to be split up into 2 different states, and where we're talking about Harper's Ferry is today's location is in West Virginia. And if we used and that's where John Brown wanted to go to seize this arsenal here and take the weapons out of it. But let's look at this place in West Virginia here. Let's take a look at Google Images. Here's a map of the United States. If we zoom in and we go to Virginia here, and there's West Virginia up here, we can zoom in and find Harper's Ferry. If we back up a little bit, we'll see the Washington D.C. is here. If we go up the Potomac River into West Virginia, we'll see right here at this confluence where the Potomac and the Shenandoah River split off, there's a place called Harper's Ferry. And it's this Harper's Ferry is where John Brown attacks the arsenal there and tries to take the weapons from it and give them to slaves in a slave rebellion. So that's Harper's Ferry. Alright, and here's the arsenal. Here's a picture of the arsenal. There's a bigger arsenal picture here. That's a present day picture of the arsenal. In this arsenal, this federal arsenal the United States government has, there's muskets in there, pistols, gunpowder, ball that you load these things up with, cannons, all sorts of things the military uses. And he wanted to get these weapons and all this stuff so these slaves could arm themselves and move themselves toward freedom. And we see that John Brown was affected by the Second Great Awakening and this idea that God wants us to clean up society. In his trial, after he's caught, he reads this in a statement. He says, "This court acknowledges the validity of the law of God. I see a book kissed, which I suppose to be the Bible, or at least the New Testament, which teaches me that all things whatsoever I would that man should do to me, I should do even so to them. It teaches me further to remember them that are in bonds, as bound with them. I endeavor to act up to that instruction. I believe that to have interfered as I have done, as I have always freely admitted I have done, in behalf of this despised poor, is no wrong but right. Now, if it is deemed necessary that I should forfeit my life for the furtherance of the ends of justice, and mingle my blood further with the blood of my children, and with the blood of millions in this slave country whose rights are disregarded by wicked, cruel, and unjust enactments, I say, let it be done." And so they do. They kill John Brown, and to many John Brown becomes a martyr. For the northern abolitionists, he becomes a martyr. To the southerners, he's just a terrorist that should have been killed. So we see this sectionalism about this John Brown's raid on Harper's Ferry is going to cause these intense feelings against the North and the South. If we compare and contrast and look at similarities between Nat Turner's rebellion as a cause and John Brown's, we see that Nat Turner was an African American, black. John Brown was white. Both had been called by God and affected by the Second Great Awakening. And both of them were violent abolitionists moving for a slave rebellion and freedom of the slaves. They had both been called by God. So those are some similarities between Nat Turner and some differences between Nat Turner and John Brown. Nat Turner was in Southampton County, Virginia. John Brown was in Harper's Ferry, Virginia, which is now West Virginia. And here's a portrait that was painted to show, pretty much to illustrate John Brown's influence on the coming Civil War. If you see it back here, the United States flag, and you see this Confederate flag, which is the Southern government. It's going to be set up called the Confederate States of America. You see them armed and going at it with one another, and slaves in the background. And you see westward expansion here is going on, and you see the land on fire and the tornado coming, and you see a dead Southern soldier and a dead Union soldier. And this picture, if we look at it and analyze it, there's a lot of symbolism in it where we can pick out some of the things we've been learning, how this man John Brown uses the Bible and his religion and this gun to lead slaves to rebellion in Pottawatomie Creek Massacre. It is emphasizing the role of John Brown in the coming of the Civil War. Okay, so John Brown's raid intensifies the divisions between the North and the South. There's tensions, divisions, sectionalism over the arguments and morality of slaves. Okay, so there's John Brown's raid we went over. Alright, in the next video we'll talk about the election of 1860, and we'll finish up the causes or events leading to the Civil War. So have we met our objective with this particular standard 9A? And we had several things to do in it. It says explain the Kansas Nebraska Act, the failure of popular sovereignty, the Dred Scott case, and John Brown's raid. I think we have. Ask questions in class. Watch this video over again. Good luck on the test. This is the Wilmot Proviso and the Compromise of 1850. These are critically important to understanding these north-south divisions, north-south tensions, this hostility on a regional level, and this idea of sectionalism, where one section of the country puts its interest above this other section of the nation as a whole. This sectionalism idea. And these are the causes leading to the Civil War. And I think we reached all the way around to the Kansas Nebraska Act. So if we look back at alright, let's move on to Standard 9. We're still in Unit 4. Let's talk about Standard 9 here, and look at it. And here's Standard 9 here, the overall focus at the top here, the Civil War. Look at it closer in a minute. We have 6 substandards, A, B, C, D, E, F. So a lot of information in this Standard 9. And let's look at this big part up here. It says the student will identify key events, issues, and individuals relating to the causes, the course, and the consequences of the Civil War. Now at 9A, it says explain the Kansas Nebraska Act. And then it says, and the failure of popular sovereignty, the Dred Scott case, and John Brown's raid. So we're going to talk about Kansas Nebraska Act. We're going to talk about the failure of popular sovereignty is connected to that, Dred Scott case, and John Brown's raid, all in this video. It's going to be a little bit longer. So essentially what we're going to do is talk about Kansas Nebraska Act, the Dred Scott case here, and then John Brown's raid. All of these are causes or events that lead us to a Civil War. Okay? We talked about a lot of these causes here in Standard 8. And we were going through those causes. We said there were many here. And we said it's very important to do well on the unit test we're going to have in class and on the EOCT to know each one of these thoroughly, okay, and how they lead to the Civil War, the causes of the Civil War. We went over Nat Turner in Standard 8. We went over the abolitionist, Frederick Douglass, Wilmot Garrison, the Grimke sisters in Standard 8, the Missouri Compromise, the nullification cry. Alright, so now we're on the Kansas Nebraska Act here. How did it cause, the central question would be, how did the Kansas Nebraska Act cause sectionalism? How did it cause north-south divisions? How did it cause our country to lead to a Civil War? Okay, so let's look at the Kansas Nebraska Act here a minute. This word act implies that when a bill becomes a law, it's called an act. When the president signs a bill that was put together by Congress, the Senate and House of Representatives, and they send it to the president, signed, it becomes an act. So this Kansas Nebraska Act